Welcome to this week's edition of The Informed. Joining me this morning is Reuben Humphreys, who is an election campaigner. He has interests in environmental health, community development, and constitutional reform. And I'm most envious about the fact that Reuben is doing his Masters in Indigenous Archaeology. Also joining us are John Heron, lawyer advocate for victims of crime and family violence. Morning, John.
Morning.
And we're lucky to have Ryan Smith with us today. Ryan is a 16-year parliamentarian in Victoria and a fabulous member for Warrandyte. Good morning, team. I'm Caroline Council. I'm an accredited family law specialist. So today we're going to chat about what's been happening in relation to our superannuation, or potentially what's going to be happening in relation to our superannuation funds. So we have a situation where Angus Taylor is coming out swinging against the current Albanese Labor government, who's intending to make potentially financially disastrous changes to superannuation for those who have invested $3 million or more. What Angus Taylor is very concerned about, of course, is bracket creep, and the fact that if they start with that level, will they then move down to 2 million? Will they move down to 1 million? And that's one of the points that he's been making. So it's always been a bit of a football, if you will, between the two parties, when they're in power and in opposition. And incoming governments often want to tinker with superannuation. What Angus Taylor is saying is this is actually a broken election promise. And I just wanted to throw it open to the group to talk about, is this something they shouldn't be doing? Should they be doing it in this term of government? Or should they be putting it to the Australian population at the next election? Ryan, why don't we kick off with you and talk about broken election promises?
Well, I mean, it's just extraordinary. I mean, the now government, then opposition, said that they wouldn't make any major changes to superannuation. They claim now that this isn't a major change, and they're being true to their word that this, they said no major changes. This isn't a major change, so we're all squeaky clean. But the reality is, I mean, anytime any government makes moves on superannuation, it should raise alarm bells and it should raise red flags, because superannuation was put in place in this form to take the burden off the government to provide old age pensions. And now there's this big, massive multi-trillion dollar pot of money that suddenly they're looking at and saying, gee, we could curb our spending, but we could also go for this money that's being saved for people's retirement. And
so, Ryan, do you think it's a case of sticky fingers? Do you think
absolutely?
Okay, so the honey and the money, as they say.
Heaven forbid they would curb their spending and maybe pull back their ideology a little bit. But it's Australians' money. It should be left. We shouldn't keep changing the rules. It's that simple to me.
John and I sort of work with the average Joe and Josephine, and if you think about people heading towards retirement, and given property prices in Australia, whilst it sounds like a big number, $3 million, that could in fact be one investment property or 1.5 investment properties. So on paper, it might look a lot of money to a lot of people who are doing it hard. But for people who are heading towards retirement, John, what are your views about that?
I was about to say what you said, but we actually see a lot of super splitting at the high end of family law, and it touches down to those other areas there. I might come back to that, but with the election, I believe this action is ideological and it's not financial for a couple of reasons there. So the idea of raising 3 or 4 billion in revenue sounds good over a long period of time. Now, on the other hand, they get Cluedos knowing the ALP because it puts the perception of anyone over $3 million is a Bill Gates, right? So that's why they're doing it. No, there's a minor thing too, is that they're all very a lot of the superannuation board space is stacked high with union members and ex-ALP politicians. That's always an out for them. Steve Bracks is one example there. So there's that there too. But on the ground with that, the change is really like moving from 3 million and above. You go from the concessional rate 15% to full on tax rate there. Now, smart money won't sit in a super fund, right? That's obvious. So the 3 million projected that they'll make will be out the window. Smart money will go elsewhere. It'll go into fixed assets, property. What I would do and advise is the old trust, and that's interesting because that's not being touched, because lo and behold, people in Canberra use it all the time.
So don't touch my money. We'll touch their money, but not mine.
Don't touch my family trust, but I'll get you super.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that, given that it's not going to come into effect, even though the legislation will come into effect this term, the actual tax won't come into effect for a few years. That'll give people plenty of time to move their money. The people who have over $3 million in their super aren't stupid when it comes to financial matters. They'll move it. The money won't be there when the time comes.
So really, yet again, the people that Labor professes to represent are possibly the ones that are going to get caught out. The people that don't have access to the top-notch advice, the people that have worked hard, scrimped, saved, done the right thing, put it into super, etc. I suspect they are potentially the ones that are going to suffer from this.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And it also means, as you say, there's going to be investment choices that perhaps don't necessarily assist Australia as a whole, if you will. So, we like to think of superannuation as being something that is good for the country, and it's potentially creating future wealth for retirees, and therefore, as Ryan said, not creating a burden on the government come retirement time. But the choices people are going to make may well not be to our interests. Thoughts about that?
Don't forget, if I can just say, that the first move on the super was not the threshold. It was tightening the screws of your ability to withdraw it in a case of a financial situation. Now, that's gone in the conversation already. I think, I'm loath to say it, but Jackie Lambie raised a reasonable point where she would have lost a house if she wasn't able to do it. And you and I also, Carolyn, get requests all the time from people for hardship. They've just had a family law bust up. They've got no cash and they don't want to lose their house because that's what's happened in the divorce. And where do they go? Can they access that? Just put that out there.
Well, it's also not just about losing the house, although that is one of one of the aspects, John. For some of my clients, it's about putting food on the table for children, because child support doesn't necessarily kick in. If you're opposed to a self-employed person who's able to manipulate their income, then they pay 2 parts of nothing. So it's really about survival. So I'm concerned about that as well, because if there's enough time to make up that withdrawal, where's the harm? We shouldn't be using super as a bank necessarily, but I think there are extenuating circumstances. And I also think about the bad old days when I was seeing a lot of young Australian men dying from AIDS, for example, and they were desperate to access funds simply to pay their medical bills. And there was just a blanket, no, you can't. So a whole generation of men really struggled to access insurances, to access super, to make their lives, such as they were at that stage, a little more comfortable. And there was a lack of humanity, if you will, in the way in which superannuation was managed.
Yeah, just so I can, on that issue too, that the first salvo of softening up the people was a bunch of the ALP Mean Girls and others coming out and saying, during COVID, $36 billion was accessed by people. Now, I've come across not hundreds, thousands of people that relied on that ability to get that $10,000 in COVID, particularly small business that had to shut their doors. Almost every small business person I know that comes to me when we look at super balances had access to that, but they didn't go down and put it on the red at Crown Casino. Right? And they use that to live.
Given that it was government decisions that stopped their income, I mean, government decisions should have allowed them to access the money they had.
That's right. And now everyone was bad for doing it. That was the reason. Now we've got to wind it back.
Yeah.
No, totally and utterly agree. So really, are we looking at government becoming big government? Are we seeing the Albanese government heading the same way that the Dan Andrews government already has in terms of feathering its public service nest? Do we think? I know, John, you said it's ideological rather than financial, but is this really a way in which Albanese can grease the wheels of the public service?
They run, Andrews and Albanese run completely parallel when it comes to ideology. There's no reason to think that the Albanese government won't go the same way as the Andrews government. They talk regularly, they're friends, they're former housemates. They are completely in line with the way they operate government. And if Albanese is around as long as Andrews has been, then we'll see much the same sort of progress in terms of government, the way government grows and the public service grows. I've no doubt about it.
So we see cycles, Ryan, in the political sphere around expenditure. We see Liberal governments pulling in the belt, paying off debt, except, in the extraordinary circumstances of COVID. And then we usually see Labor coming in, often reformist, but often spending. Usually, I don't want to use the term like banshees, but I will, wild banshees even. So are we potentially seeing that phenomenon? Like, you've got Chalmers saying, look, it's Australia's burdened by debt and we've got to do something about reducing the debt. But given the history of behaviour by successive Labor governments in the expenditure space, what faith can we have that money saved is in fact going to be money retiring our national debt? Or are we just going to see more of the bust elements of Labor governments? What's the prediction?
D, all of the above.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. There's no reason to think that the Labor government federally is going to do anything any different. I mean, they're already, talking about taxing more. They're already, the verbal gymnastics that Jim Chalmers embarked on when he was talking to Koshy yesterday about taxing, putting capital gains tax on the family home. Yes, they've vigorously denied it, but they also said there wouldn't be any changes to super just a year ago. So I don't believe anything. I think that when the time comes to finance their ideologies, they will look at any pot of money they possibly can.
Yeah.
And grow in the process.
Yeah, indeed. And then, Liberal have to come back in and tighten those belts, as I said before. I also caught Angus Taylor talking with Michael Rowland on ABC Breakfast, and Michael was really giving it to him and saying, well, this is the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it? Because in the 2016 election, you were planning to do exactly the same. So going back to that theme of broken election promises, Angus Taylor made the point of, yes, we were, but we were going to put it to the public, the voting public. We weren't, in fact, going to put it through as legislation during our term. We were going to take it to the voting public and see if it had wings and was going to fly. So what's different about the Albanese government, of course, is they're planning to make this law in the current term, which leads back to that question of, is this a blatant broken promise? Can the same accusation be hurled at the Malcolm Turnbull and his proposal to start to tamper with superannuation? I think the answer is they are two different, very, very different propositions to the voters of Australia.
And that could be true. I mean, I've got a kind of a blanket easy rule: don't touch our super. And I think that whether you're going to take something to an election or not, I mean, it's an election loser as far as I'm concerned. I think that, it was set up to take the burden off government. It was set up to give certainty to people. It's not the government's money. It's that simple. I don't care if it's Liberal, Labor, I don't care who it is. Don't touch the super. It's people's retirement savings. And if you muck around with it enough, people won't invest in it anymore. It's that simple.
Do you think also, just a broader based question about wealth creation in Australia, do you think Australia has lost opportunities, particularly during mining booms, to consolidate our wealth as a nation? It seems to me that this is, just typical sort of, oh my God, there's the Jenny, let's rub the lamp and he'll give us 3 wishes. whereas we've had abundance, and I don't think we've necessarily capitalised on the abundance that has been as in this country.
I've read lots of criticisms about the Costello-Howard years where we could have put more aside. I think that the work that was done during that period, and I would say that being a Howard and Costello fan, but the debt got paid off and the future fund was started, and there were plans, had they stayed in office, for other future funds to deal with things like education and things of that nature going forward. It was a good long-term plan, and it's still in place, which is great. But yes, I do think there's probably an opportunity lost in that period. And we've got going back to the changes to superannuation. I think that even talking of, Andrew's talking locally in Victoria about accessing people's super to pay for his SEC and to have that co-investment between government and the super funds. Again, when governments start coming in and telling you what to do with what is essentially your savings and your long-term investment, people just get scared by that, and I think rightfully so.
Absolutely. All right, team, any last comments?
I might throw in one if I may.
Certainly, Reuben.
I think there's an unaddressed issue here in that part of the concept behind superannuation was that it was going to be a major investment into the Australian economy. By having all those funds invested, and ideally within Australia, so they're invested all over the world, there would be future growth that comes from that. So any tampering with the super arrangements, any disincentive to have your money parked there is going to eat into our future growth and our future ability to pay for things, aside from the individual who is investing in superannuation. It's going to have real ongoing consequences. I don't think it's okay.
I think this is a gift to the opposition. There's a 2.5-year scare campaign that can be run by a smart media operator, and I think Angus Taylor's pretty good in that regard. Nothing that they say about what they plan to do or what they may or may not plan to do in the future can be taken as an ironclad guarantee, given their comments before the election and what's happening now. So I think people are very, very protective of their super, and I guess the older the demographic, the more concerned they are that there'll be changes. But there is a scare campaign for the opposition wrapped up with a bow, and they should use it to its fullest extent.
Yeah,
and that's why we need strong opposition. Sorry, John.
The franking issue was a big loser for Albo at the previous election, and his think tank did that. Interesting, I heard a story during a week of how funding of think tanks and for pressuring people to vote. I heard of a large union paying $1.5 million outside of the election stuff for the state election. So this is how they sort of move public opinion. I also need to say that the Australian economy is it's not it can't create a future fund like Norway, right? It just doesn't have the political will to do that, and this is impossible. The country is completely reliant on debt. It's a very low capital country, very hard to raise capital. It's the concentration on housing is more than unhealthy, right? It can lead to absolute disaster. So at the moment, 70% of housing debt mortgages is raised by short-term paper issued in Asia and around the world too. That's been the case since I worked in banking 20 years ago. That's how it's funded. That tap gets pulled out with a few crises, then the housing market collapse. Everything in Australia, from a banking and a business perspective, comes back to housing, right? Yeah. So watch out in that space.
And of course, the rest of the world was scratching its head and looking at Australia in terms of its dependence on housing and looking at the overinflated prices, just saying this bubble has to burst. And yet we kept trucking on. It's a pity we're not like Norway. It's a pity we don't have that fund to back us up, because imagine what we could do with our country. But alas, is this, the byproduct of election cycles? I suspect so. We can only wish for a benign autocracy, I guess. All right. Thank you so much, Reuben, Ryan and John, for joining us on The Informed this week. I'm your host, Caroline Council. See you next week.